I mean, I have another set of cousins at my aunt, but I have a cousin who's on the island. 2 years I saw the flyer on Facebook. I don't know the answer. No, but so nice to meet you. That's what I'm carrying this. There you go. I was actually
She's in the back. That was the so these are my so we have food with live streaming. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I don't want to disabuse or of the situation, but everybody's over here. Yeah, I feel that. If they really feel they're doing something, I mean, I wear a mask. Yeah, exactly. So, I'm fine.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you. Hope you're on the same track as to how different disciplines, the accuracy of their paperwork here. But you have just I share fine. Respond to announcements, first minutes. Probably church Sunday. Broken down, but as I watched state of Texas, I know state house. They were both to say anything like that. So we're going to go down with my craft. They will say there's some there's but also the one that's it. Yeah. And the movie was at Dallas, something or other. Anyhow, yeah, but he's white, and so that was the town was, like prominent. So now it's just yeah. He's so like that. With all the heart. And I know the process. But I'm just for any no one is safe. That was the guy that they could move everybody was frozen. Yes. I don't know. testimony. And I think we can say somebody. Obviously, somebody.
I know.
I think it's about it.
So that's part of your. I hear you.
You know, but I'm federal. So anyway,
Yeah.
I'm a.
Well, I guess it's, yeah. You know, when I teach, they call me yes. And, but they go. Oh, boy. It's important work. The thing that's so the spirit. You know, this
No way. Yeah, I thought you were I thought you
Oh, you're good. I just came on here. Yeah. I can't hear you. Yeah, they took somebody out. I don't know. Maybe you go really sorry.
And then I also
I need 50. Yeah, but I don't mind. Okay, well, make it sound like. Down in the middle of the item.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us for this historic opportunity and conversation, Exonerating a History, is Callie House and the Empirical Case for Reparations. We are so excited to have all of you here in person, as well as those who are live streaming on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Please share this information. We want to have as many people on the stream and in the room as possible for this critical conversation. My name is Devin Jerome Crawford. I'm the staff director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, where we are led by Professor Cornell William Brooks, who I will introduce in a few moments. We are so excited to have not only Professor Brooks, our colleagues from the Harvard Kennedy School, but also members of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs and the National Congress of Black Women with us for this historic opportunity. So at this time, I won't belabor the hour. I want to introduce none other than Professor Cornell William Brooks, the House of Professors, Professor for the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations, and the Professor of Practice of Public Leadership and Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as the Visiting Professor of Prophetic Religion at the Harvard Divinity School. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please offer a robust round of applause for Professor Cornell William Brooks.
Good evening, everyone. It is such a delight and honor to be in this wonderful space talking about such an incredibly important topic, and this being the focus of tonight's conversation. So what I'd like to do, Stuart is always listening. So what I'd like to do is to welcome our guests onto the stage. Take a moment to set the. All right. Take a moment to set the stage and the topic and to open up for this evening. So let me just welcome to the stage Ron Sullivan, Congressman Sheila Jackson Lee, and my colleague, Professor Linda Domas, and I'll formally introduce them. Let me have them come onto the stage. Take a seat down here, if that's comfortable. Okay. Professor Sullivan, Professor Domas. So if I could just set the stage for a moment, when we think about reparations, it has been the subject of debate and discourse for well over a century and a half, going back to the founding of this country. When we think about a woman by the name of Belinda Sutton, who sued, or rather petitioned, the Massachusetts state legislature that she might receive a pension for her having been kidnapped, taken into captivity, and enslaved. When we think about a woman by the name of Henrietta Wood, who was a free Black woman who was literally stolen from Ohio, taken to Texas, Congresswoman, enslaved for the duration of the Civil War. And then she filed suit in order to be compensated for the liberty that she was denied, for the body that was taken. When we think about Callie House, an undernoted figure of history who literally years before Mark Morial, the Urban League, years before the NAACP created the largest grassroots reparations movement at the turn of the century before last. And when we think about no less a figure than Harriet Tubman. We know Harriet Tubman as a conductor, if you will, on the Underground Railroad, but we think less about her as a veteran of the Civil War, who, after having served as a scout, being the first woman to lead men in battle in this country, appealed to the United States Congress for a pension. She received a pension, but it was a pension that was set aside for her husband, which was given to her as a widow. Over and over and over again, Black women have stood up for their rights and our rights. Tonight, we honor an unsung figure of history by the name of Mrs. Callie House. I'll leave our panelists to share her story. Tonight is an occasion for story and statistics, for the empirical and the narrative. It is an occasion for us to talk about the face of reparation, but also the figures, the quantitative case, the empirical case for reparations. So we've invited a distinguished group of panelists to lift up this conversation that we might discuss and debate and ultimately respond to the call of history to honor our foremothers, our forefathers, our forebears by lifting up the cause of reparations in our time. So I'd like to introduce our panelists formally. And before we open up, I have a friend in the audience. If you just pardon me, and it's going to be a point of personal privilege. My colleague, Mark Morial, who's led the Urban League for many more years than he would appear, given how youthful he looks. But he's been a colleague in the work, a supporter in the work, and I'm going to ask him to just say a few words at the outset. Thereafter, we'll introduce our guests again.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Let me thank Cornell for the invitation to just share a few thoughts with you all this evening, as well as for his leadership and his long-standing commitment to justice. Let's give him a nice hand here. Thank you, Cornell. And the other panelists, of course, appreciate you, but especially my sister and longtime friend in this work and in this struggle, Sheila Jackson Lee, who has taken up the mantle that was put down in the Congress in 1989, late John Conyers, who in 1989 introduced, as you know, Cornell, the first legislation calling for an examination and a study of reparations. What's striking to me is that reparations is not new. Slave owners in the South were paid reparations in the early 1860s as compensation for quote unquote losing their property as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation. our Japanese brothers and sisters were paid reparations as a result of the unfair and unjust internment of them during World War II. At this moment, with the tragic event of May 25th, 2020, the murder of George Floyd, there's been an awareness, a reckoning, and an awakening about this issue of institutionalized, structural, and systemic racism and exclusion. And I think it is the platform and the chassis that gives us a better chance to educate the nation and policymakers about the rationale, the reason, and what reparations would mean. And I certainly leave it to the experts to fill in the important blanks, to help educate us in a profound way. But this is a long battle. I like to think of us, those of us, Cornell, like yourself and Sheila Jackson Lee, and those in the academy as well, and those of you who are here tonight, as perfectors, the originators of the American ethos, Constitution, Bill of Rights, and vision were lofty in their rhetoric and lacking in their execution. And for this nation, as it faces its 250th birthday, to be able to sustain and thrive beyond in a profound way means it must come not in a cosmetic, superficial way with the impact that race has had, but confront it in a substantial, meaningful way. So thank you, Cornell.
Thank you.
And as Sheila Jackson Lee knows, and as all know, we have placed the endorsement of the National Urban League behind HR 40 in a strong and an issue whose time has come. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, brother.
So over a year ago, I had the occasion of calling upon one of my brothers on the faculty of the Harvard Law School to come to our aid in lifting up the cause, the forgotten cause, the concern of a woman too few people know about. That would be Mrs. Callie House. I called upon Professor Ron Sullivan to engage in what we call an exoneration of history. Professor Sullivan is the Jesse Klemenko Clinical Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. He's a leading theorist in the areas of criminal law, criminal procedure, trial practice, techniques, legal ethics, and race theory. He's a faculty director of the Harvard Criminal Justice Institute and the Harvard Trial Advocacy Workshop. For those of you who are not attorneys, those are the places you go to become excellent attorneys. And he leads in that effort. He has merged legal theory and practice over the course of a career in unique and cutting edge ways. Indeed, he sought out to represent clients in cases that many in the legal community deemed to be impossible. So you recall when Michael Brown was profiled, not for murder, not for rape, not for robbery, but for jaywalking. And when DOJ was unable to hold his killer accountable, it was Ron Sullivan who came to the side of the Brown family and secured a settlement, a modicum of justice for a grieving family. Stand up, please. Professor Sullivan's work is dedicated in service of the underserved communities around the country. In fact, Huffington Post dubbed him the man who dealt the biggest blow to mass incarceration. He has merged the legal academy and the real world in long and varied ways. In 2014, Professor Sullivan was tasked to design and implement a conviction review unit for the newly elected Brooklyn District Attorney, the late Ken Thompson. The CRU, as it is called, is designed to identify and exonerate the wrongly convicted, which became a model for conviction integrity programs in the nation. Professor Sullivan serves as chair of the Criminal Justice Advocacy Committee within Senator Barack Obama's presidential campaign. He served as a member of the National Legal Advisory Committee. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, he was asked to create a system to solve a criminal justice crisis. He was a visiting scholar for the Law Society of Kenya. He joined the Harvard's faculty after having served at my alma mater, Yale Law School, and he led the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. For those of you who may not know, that is a stellar flagship institution. So in other words, if you ever find a friend or relative who's in dire straits, that's the place that you go. And he led that place. He's a 5-headed Kappa graduate from Morehouse College, like Devin Jerome Crawford, and the Harvard Law School, where he served as president of BOLSA. And I simply ask that you welcome Brother Sullivan to this place. It is also my deep honor to welcome to the stage my colleague, Linda Bilmes. Some of you may not know her name, but you know her work. She is the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Senior Lecturer in Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, a leading expert on budgetary and public financial issues. Her research focuses on budgeting, public administration, the public, private, and non-profit sectors. At the Kennedy School, she has led the Greater Boston Applied Field Lab, an advanced academic program in which teams of students and student volunteers assist local communities in public finance and operations. She was the Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary and Chief Financial Officer for the U.S. Department of Commerce under then President Bill Clinton. And you may know her from her book that she co-authored with Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz, The 3 Trillion, that is with a T, the $3 trillion war, the true cause of the Iraq conflict. She is the recipient of the 2008 Speaking Truth to Power Award by the American Friends Service Committee. She is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration, holds a BA and an MBA from Harvard, and a DPhil from Oxford. And let me note this, she came to me over a year ago and said, what might we do in service of exploring the cost of reparations and how it might be paid for? A group of students, African-American students at the Harvard Kennedy School and the Harvard Law School, came to her, and she as a professor came to me, and that's why I'm in service of her. Can you put your hands together for Professor Burke? Now, lastly, before my new career at the Kennedy School, I had a dubious distinction of serving as president and CEO of the NAACP. And in that job, you meet a great number of people, many of whom call themselves leaders. Then you meet a smaller subset of people who are in fact leaders. I met Sheila Jackson Lee, both in Texas and in Washington, on many occasions where I've often found her busy at work doing the business of the people. She's an influential and forceful voice in Washington, having serving her 14th term as a member of the United States House of Representatives. She represents the 18th Congressional District of Texas, centered in Houston, which is the energy capital of the world. She sits on 3 congressional committees, a senior member of the House Committee on the Judiciary and Homeland Security, and is appointed by the leadership as a member of the crucial, as in critical, Budget Committee. She has authored and introduced and saw the passage and the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. She's introduced several bills, including the Juvenile Accountability Block Grant Reauthorization and Bullying and Prevention and Intervention Act, the Federal Prison Bureau and Nonviolent Offender Relief Act. And she is regarded as one of the most influential and impactful and effective members of Congress. She's a past ranking member of the Homeland Security Subcommittee for Maritime and Border Security, where she co-authored HR 1417, a bipartisan bill which has been touted as the best vehicle for accomplishing comprehensive immigration reform in the U.S. House of Representatives. Past chairwoman of the Homeland Security Subcommittee on Transportation, Security, and Infrastructure Protection, named by Congressional Quarterly as one of the 50 most effective members of Congress, and U.S. News and World Report named her as one of the 10 most influential legislators in the House. Now, if that weren't enough, now I'm saying again, like Brother Mark L'Oreal, her youthful appearance,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But she was one of the first women graduates of my alma mater, Yale College. Okay, received a BA in political science from Yale, with the first graduating class including women, followed by JD from the University of Virginia. She's married to Dr. Elwyn Lee, who's a Yale graduate administrator at the University of Houston, has 2 children, one of whom is a graduate of Harvard, the other graduate of Duke, and who's a member of the Harris County Board of Education. She's a grandmother as well. Listen, can you all put your hands together for Representative Steve? So we want to begin with a question that goes beyond simply the statistics and the prominent figures of reparation history. So I want to just start with asking each of you, given all the things that you do, why have you made reparations a topic that is still in 2022 a point of controversy, a point of contestation for many people? Why are you making this a professional priority? So Professor Sullivan, if I can start with you, and then Professor Bilmes and Representative Sheila Jackson.
Well, I'll pick up where Mark Muriel left off. He said that it's nothing new, and that's right. And it should not be anything that's controversial either. It's been going on for a long time, a whole bunch of groups, and it makes a lot of sense. It is compensatory. We've somehow turned reparations into a bad word. No, well, we haven't. Let me put it this way. I'll be very brief. Linguists have this phrase, they say, words accrete meaning over time. That means just, words change. We all heard nice. Nice used to mean silly. Now it's a good thing. And naughty used to mean you don't have anything. Now it means bad. Right? But some people actively, this is organic, but some people actively change the meaning over time. And reparations in many circles carries with it a connotation that it's a giveaway. It's not, it's compensatory, it's earned. And that's why I spend so much time on it.
Professor Bilmes.
So
can you hear me now?
yes.
Thank you so much to Cornell and to my distinguished panelists here. As Cornell mentioned, I came to this because some of my students came to me, the president of the Harvard Law School Black Students Association, the Harvard Business School Black Students Association, and the Harvard Kennedy School Black Students Association. And they asked me to work on this subject with them. I explained to them that I had very little background, no background in this subject. I had spent many years as a partner at Boston Consulting Group working on projects in Europe. I had spent my academic career working on estimating the costs of war and estimating the value of biodiversity in ecosystems. So, but they were very persuasive, and I began to work on this project with Cornell joining this project. And I think we all found pretty quickly a big shock, which is that we discovered that there are actually hundreds of federal programs that pay reparatory compensation. They don't call it reparations, but it is reparatory compensations. There are programs for those impacted by trade, by weather, agriculture, bank loss, pension loss, sardine fishermen, Christmas tree growers, workplace injuries, vaccine injuries, nuclear exposure, pesticide exposure. There are hundreds of programs that benefit millions of Americans. And so here we are 2 years later, and we are still excavating and researching these many programs which show that, in fact, reparations are actually routine and commonplace. I would also say that on a personal note, I have been for most of my life a practicing Quaker, and I feel privileged to work on this project.
Mm, mm. Representative Lee, I'm simply repeating the question that one of the things I'll note is, given the breadth of issues that you work on in Congress, and also just given the frustratingly slow, at least according to the populace, the pace of reparations. Why this? Why is this a part on a personal level?
Well, first of all, it gives me great pleasure, privilege to go anywhere to discuss this question. And thank you for the question. Thank you, first of all, for the wonderful center that I will immerse myself in. Thank you, Professor, for your expertise. And it's bad, President Morial, when you come and see new people, Washington grabs them up. I'm putting them on my list. I'm thinking of my hearings. And I see 3 new witnesses. Professor Brooks has been there, but now I've got some others to add to it. So it's a delight to be with you, Professor Sullivan as well. President Morial, I cannot sit in this chair without honoring both you and your lovely spouse, my dear friend, for just the friendship. And just as a footnote, before I answer, I guess almost decades, Mark, you'll have to tell me, of the State of the Black Union, State of Black America, are rich documents that will be incorporated, will be looked at. The history that you have captured is absolutely amazing. And that will be certainly the kind of reach that a commission will be engaged in. But let me give you my heart. For 10 years, I introduced legislation on Juneteenth. Now, most people would argue and try to one-ups me. You mean that soda pop holiday? One not known beyond the borders of Texas, though as I've come to understand, there are about 47, 48 states that were celebrating Juneteenth, but how were they doing? But I did it for 10 years. And finally, this new president came, and we quickly introduced the federal holiday, and I introduced it the first, just to follow up on the 10 years of the resolution over and over again. And within a miracle time, Opal Lee, I call her the grandmother. I'm the godmother. She's a precious dear sister and brought me 1 million petitions, I think about 2019 before the pandemic. And so we passed it. President Biden whispered in my ear and said, I may do many things in my life. And, you know, some people probably smirk, but he whispered and said, if I'm known for anything, I may be known for passing or signing this federal holiday. So why did I keep on that? I have an emotional and visceral, how should I say it, reflection on how little we pay attention to 246 years of individuals who were born, who lived and died in slavery. Never to be honored. Many of them dropped where they were, buried in unmarked graves, lived a brutal life in many instances. Even before we start calculating those who were hung, because we start calculating those who were hung, we said about 4,000. We don't really know if that's the right number, because start calculating really toward the end of the 19th century, more into the 20th century, in the early days of 1900 Jim Crow days, when you could walk down a dark southern road and not be seen again. But I really pondered on that. Yale opened one of the first African American Studies Department, Dr. Blasingame, whose name should be known, gave me the opportunity alongside my political science degree to have some focus there. But it was really a personal outrage that these folk built this country, and that not only were they not acknowledged, but they were not acknowledged as it relates to the economic engine they were. And that means that unpaid, uncompensated, no life insurance, no salary. They made cotton king. They made the landed South rich. And they created the transatlantic cotton trade as well as the transatlantic slave trade. And in essence, they built the Wall Street banks and the commodities exchange in Chicago. Never to be, in the history books, you'll never see that attribution, never. They built the White House. They built the Capitol, and many people don't know they were human ladders. And when you come to the Capitol and you look back and you admire the dome, we did that and fell to our death. And when one fell, we get another one, slave. So it was the passionate sense that I had an obligation. Juneteenth was to say to the nation, you have to stop. You have a federal holiday. I'm gonna get on a crusade because I have people telling me, well, my company's not giving me that holiday. It was only 2 years old, but you have a federal holiday. You have a moment, and I'll conclude in just a moment. You'll have a moment to get up on Juneteenth and do something personal. When I say that, do a remembrance. And you get to the beach after that or get where you need to go, but you can do a remembrance. That's on Juneteenth. So it connects, that was way after, but it connects to my work with John Conyers on HR 40. And I'm honored as he retired that he handed it to me. And we took leaps and bounds and got the first hearing, standing room only. Friends on the other side could find everything to comment on. And then, of course, now with 217 co-sponsors, we've got more co-sponsors than we've ever gotten. So the idea of reparations, of course, and I hope I will get a moment to throw some of these documents at you, because in Congress, in the hearings, we're always holding up papers about we're reading this or holding this up. So I've got some show and tell, and I just need to show and tell everybody. But I will finish on saying it was to honor those whose shoulders I stand on.
Yes, yes.
And I figured that if I was in Congress and I could do Homeland Security and I could have leadership in judiciary and I could write the budget, that I could take a moment to step aside and use that power just to reflect who I am. My hair is rough, my skin is dark, and I have that bounty, and there's multiple colors in our race because those folk didn't drink the Kool-Aid. They lasted, they stayed. And that's why I wanted to just be able to be real about HR 40. It is deserving. I yield back.
Now, it's not everybody who can hold half the Library of Congress in their lap and look so elegant. Professor Sullivan is a leading criminal law theorist and practitioner. One of the things I want to ask of you is the criminal legal injustices suffered by African Americans have served as a predicate for the call for reparations. The convict leasing system, the slave codes that merged into and morphed into the Black codes, the new Jim Crow as in the present incarnation of Jim Crow in the form of mass incarceration. All those have served as predicates and a premise for the call for reparations. But I'd ask that you tell us a little about Callie House as the godmother, as a godmother of the reparations movement. You're a criminal law professor. Can you tell us about her criminal case, the injustice she suffered? Because there might be some folks who don't quite know that story. Anybody nod your hand? Maybe you don't know all the details. Because this is now, like in the pulpit, the modestly talented preacher will set up the big time preacher. I got to set this story up. So can you tell us the story of the injustice that she saw?
Absolutely. Can I,
Oh, sorry.
well, no, yeah, this will do the trick. I normally don't need a mic, but I assume we need one for the streaming. So yes, so I do wrongful convictions. This is one of the things that my institute does. And this was one of the most egregious wrongful convictions in the history of the United States of America. So way back in 1896, Callie House founded an organization. I always invert the words. I'm gonna read this. The National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief Bounty and Pension Association. 1896, and as Reverend Brooks said, the first mass reparations movement in America. And it was huge. So the hook that Callie House used was pensions, right? So, and as other speakers have said, this notion of reparations was not new. The form, the way at which citizens got to reparations varied. And one technique was pensions. It's a familiar technique. You work, you pay into a system, you get something out of the system. So her idea was to organize around this idea of pensions for ex-slaves. Again, not a radical idea in theory. It seems right. That's what you should get. But you know when you're doing something good when folk come after you. Right? And they came after her. Who's the they? Postal Commission. How? Because she used the mail to send letters out in order to coalesce support around this idea. They charged her with fraud. Now, Reverend Brooks will know the theory better than me because he went to Yale. Fraud means that you gotta say something false first, right? You don't have to have gone to law school to know that. Someone commits fraud on you, they told you something that wasn't true. What did she say that wasn't true? Were people enslaved? Were they not paid? Right? I mean, she said nothing that wasn't true, but they said she used an organization, used the mail in order to defraud ex-slaves. A lot of people don't know that. Those were the putative victims. Those were the people who were supposed to be the victims, ex-slaves. She defrauded them by telling them that they should organize to get reparations, reparatory justice. Now just think about that. Think about that. Right? The ex-slaves were the victims. I am sure that none of them complained. Right? So they went about and charged her with this fraud, the U.S. Postal Commission. There were two other agencies that had jurisdiction, but the Postal Commission was the one that ultimately filed the papers against her and convicted. Got a conviction, federal court, on this theory of fraud, for which he was sentenced to a year in prison. And that's one way to kill a movement, right? That's one way to kill a movement. It was a shamble of a trial, unjust, start to finish. That wasn't new. Black folks at that era, to the extent they did get a trial, oftentimes it was a sham of a trial. But it was one of the most unjust trials in our history. And it ought to be undone. We ought to say something about it. There's a symbolic significance to getting this well, it's not technically overturned, but by getting a posthumous pardon to show her innocence. And it's got a substantive value too, in addition to the symbolic. And the substantive is to show that what she did was real, what she did was not fraudulent, and what she did can and should serve as a basis today for how we might think about and how we might organize around the idea of reparations. And I'll end with this. Even outside of the criminal law, Professor Brooks, this idea of reparatory justice sits at the very center of our legal order. From British common law to US common law, the whole idea behind what we call damages in law is at the highest level of theory to make the aggrieved whole. That's what the damages are about. If there's a breach of contract, you give someone $5, the thing doesn't work, you gotta be made whole. You get your $5 back. There are a lot of different ways we can make people whole, a lot of different theories to get at it, but make people whole. And where there are no contracts, our law gives us an equitable relief. It's called unjust enrichment. Unjust enrichment. The law calls it in quantum merit. So you can't get something for free. Folks all over the country, from the founding of the country, because it came from British common law, have asserted unjust enrichment as a theory to be made whole. Why can't ex-slaves? Why can't the descendants of ex-slaves argue that others were unjustly enriched because of the services and labor that they provided? It's a quite consistent theory with how we do law in the US. So that I went a little bit beyond your question, apologies. That's the Reader's Digest version of Callie House, and I'm sure we'll get into more details as the evening goes on.
I believe that we've engaged in some false advertising because this was billed as a mere panel and not a seminar at the Harvard Law School. But you all will forgive us for going beyond what we promised. Professor Sullivan lifted up the fact that Callie House as a laundress, right? She didn't. I don't recall her having a JD from Harvard Law School or an MBA. She was a laundress, right? And she thought that the pension program designed for Civil War veterans could be a model for reparations. So on the panel tonight, we have one of the nation's and literally the world's leading experts on military budgets and pensions in the person of Linda Billings. And so Callie House, when she used the pension program as a precedent, as an argument for reparations, they took her seriously enough to prosecute her. But they did not take her example as precedent. Can you cite other precedents, other examples, so that we might, was Callie House wrong?
Well, let me just say a word about Callie House to start with. I am surrounded here on this panel and in this room by great orators, and I am a more quiet nerd with a background in accounting and economics. One of the things I really like about Callie House is that she was both. I mean, Callie House, very much a product of the end of the 19th century, understood the concept of deferred compensation. Now, deferred compensation, which is what she tried to achieve, is the foundation of all the, pensions, 401ks, stock options, Social Security, and she understood the value and established the precedent of fighting for deferred compensation. And she tried to get $68 million, which is about 1.3 billion today, based very specifically on a very specific calculation of the value of the cotton that was picked between 1862 and 1868. She didn't ask for a penny more than the actual value of the cotton produced by the labor of herself and others during that 6-year period. It was exactly what we call today deferred compensation. Now, in doing so, she went extraordinarily far. I mean, her movement actually led to a bill in a Senate bill, Senate 1176, and a House bill, the first slave pension bill. So she went remarkably far for a woman of her era, and at that time when pensions were just coming into being. However, if we fast forward 100 years, we have 100 years more of harms that, although rooted in chattel slavery, harms related to a wide variety of things, to housing, education, criminal justice, voting rights, healthcare, which have intertwined and compounded over time. In fact, our students depicted this relationship as a tree with the roots in the ground in slavery, and all of these harms coming up through the trunk into living branches and leaves, with people alive today who are holding these harms. Now, when we look at we conducted an audit of dozens of the hundreds of federal programs that compensate individuals for harms, and found many that essentially compensate people today for harms from long ago. So would you like me to provide an example now?
I just think that people love to have one.
Right. So there are many, but let me give you one example that, and I could go on and on and on here, but let me give you one example, which is the reparatory compensation for individuals who were exposed to nuclear radiation during the US testing program during the early part of the Cold War, which has to date, so this is from 1945 to 1960, which starting in 2000 has paid out since 2000 more than $25 billion to more than 225,000 claimants. So the background here is that from 1945 to 1960, the US conducted nuclear weapons tests, they engaged in uranium mining and processing and so forth. And for many, many years, there were people trying to get compensation for the various ailments that people who were exposed to this radiation were suffering from. And this included people who lived there, people involved in research, manufacturing, transportation, waste disposal, potentially millions of people exposed. There were a number of lawsuits filed, all of which were dismissed by the appellate courts. And after decades of grassroots advocacy and legal challenges, the federal government finally, in the late 1980s, began to hold hearings around the country of mostly the descendants of those who had been exposed to nuclear radiation through these programs. In response, Congress enacted several programs, two main programs, one in 1990, which was financed through a trust fund, and another one in 2000, which compensated a much wider group of workers. I won't go through all of the details here, but there were hearings again in the 2000s held around the country in the 12 states in which these nuclear tests had taken place. The hearings were often co-chaired by members of Congress. And then Energy Secretary Bill Richardson was a major proponent of this, of providing reparatory compensation for this purpose.
Mm.
Now, just to show you the kind of thinking that went on when these laws were enacted, which, as I as I just said, have already paid out $25 billion to hundreds of thousands of individuals. In the presidential executive order, which established one of the programs, it says, since World War II, hundreds of thousands of men and women have served their nation in building its nuclear defense. In the course of their work, they overcame previously unimagined scientific challenges. Thousands of Americans paid a high price for their service. While the nation can never fully repay these workers or their families, they deserve recognition and compensation for their sacrifices. Now, I maintain that with dozens of programs along these lines, where in this case, half a century later, I mean, we held hearings and created a program, which in this case goes through compensation provided to children, to grandchildren, to great nephews, and so forth on a sliding scale. This not only shows precedent, but it also shows that the government is capable of designing and administering programs at scale.
So, colleagues, I hope that point that was so powerfully stated is one that everyone connects with, namely the notion that when you hear, for example, Senator Mitch McConnell, your dear colleague, who says, why should we have reparations for something that happened 150 years ago? If Professor Doma says that we have a precedent for recognizing a harm, compensating direct victims of the harm, but also their descendants, that would be people like you, right? So what I'm hearing there is that there's a precedent. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, one of the things that strikes me, and you're a great student of the institution of Congress. How is it that Callie House manages to generate a bill in Congress supporting reparations? Y'all recall Edmund Pettus, as in the Edmund Pettus Bridge, right? In Selma. Now, Edmund Pettus, racist, segregationist, even he signed on to the bill because he understood that if Black people get money, Southern white people might get some of the money, right? So these are the things I'm really wrestling with it. Now, Callie House gets Edmund Pettus to sign on. A majority of members of Congress didn't sign on. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington didn't really sign on. The question I have for you is, how do you get your colleagues to sign on? Right? I think you have some Edmund Pettuses in Congress. So if you can just speak to, what's the argument for getting your colleagues to sign on, one, and then if you could just speak to the objections from your predictable opponents, but also the objections from those you would expect to be your supporters. I apologize for asking that, a rude question, but I have to ask.
The pointed question.
Pointed question.
The professor just coined the phrase that I'd heard earlier about your able assistant, preparatory compensation. The word reparations, though we were successful in this unbelievable next step for a bill, which is to get it in markup. That is when the bill is ready for the floor of the House. The word reparations, for some, is so striking that they begin to try and retreat. We, however, in our debates and our conversations in the committee room, we were speaking of restoration and repair, and we mixed in reconciliation. But I will say to you that it offends me that the very logical explanation of Professor is not easily swallowed when it comes to the finalization of the product. I assume that executive order was signed under Bill Clinton or earlier than that. around Clinton. So presidents sign executive orders all the time. One of the strategies we are using is an executive order because of the very individual mentioned by Dr. Brooks. And that is an individual who is the minority leader in the United States Senate, and who I interact with and call him Callie. But he added to that, why do you need reparations when we gave you President Barack Obama? I don't know who gave us President Barack Obama. We were not given anything. I think we voted, the nation voted. And so we were not given anything. So I make a very strong argument that when we went to our colleagues, and I will give them credit, there were many who say, sign me on, because individual colleagues understood. 217 is a big number. Understood that this was not harmful. This was the concept that Callie House and Edmund Pettis coming together had. You lift one vote, you lift all votes. And that is the concept that we want to use, but we also want to use, and now I'm gonna just have to hold up some paperwork. We also want to use the harm is sizable. And evidencing the harm, people just have to step back and say, wow. And so first of all, I want to accept the challenge of your students and accept the challenge of working on the part. However, you can evidence it. We all got a list of individuals wrongly incarcerated in the 21st century that we're trying to get a pardon for, but I want to join that effort. But just let me hold some papers up before they fall, and I'm answering that question. But median white household now, 2019, which is just 3 years ago, is 188,200 in wealth, 7.8 times that of a typical Black household, which is 24,100. Sometimes the circles we travel in, we don't realize those numbers are real. It is still today very stark. Another show and tell that I wish to hold up, and that is the number of letters that I have written. Letters that I have written to something called the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. In my congressional district, and somebody would say, well, have you been doing your job? Well, absolutely, but it's historic. It's over the years. 488 concrete batch companies are in the African-American community or in the urban centers. What are those? For those on this coast is where you make concrete right next door to someone's home. You poison the air, you poison the soil, you poison the children, you poison the families, and you create respiratory illnesses. Harm. Harvard Medical School did a study and indicated that if we had gotten reparations before COVID, your numbers would not have been as stark. As the immediate impact of COVID was in New York, the highest number of deaths at that time before testing and before even knowing what it was were African Americans. It went to New Orleans, it took out musicians, renowned people that you know. It hit Detroit, it took numbers out that you would not have believed. It came to Texas and began hitting both us and the Latino community. So the harm is a stark reality. We can document the harm. I got one other paper that I need to, if I can find it as I talk. One of the things that I know Professor Sullivan will acknowledge is the school to prison pipeline. We all talk about it. We're all trying to do something about it. But if I find it here, I'll mention it. The discipline of Black boys is outrageous. Black public preschool children, preschool, are suspended from school at high rates. Black preschool children are 3.6 times as likely to receive one or more out-of-school suspensions as white preschool children. Preschool. Preschool. Black children represent 19% of preschool enrollment, but 47% of preschool children receiving one or more out-of-school suspensions. In comparison, white children represent 41% and 28% of getting the out-of-school suspension. Black boys represent 19% of male preschool, but 45% of male preschool receiving one or more out-of-school suspension. It goes on and on and on. Of course, you know that. The issue dealing with children that are special needs, there are approximately 1.1 million Black students in the special need program versus 610 Latino and 700,000, 210,000 English learners. But we are 1.1 million. I won't give you any more of those numbers, but let me go to the point that I want to make. So we use the soft touch. We use the obvious touch, which is you can't not be for this. The word always stuck out though, is reparations. What am I going to say about it? You know, why is it for you all and not for someone else? Japanese Americans were enormously supportive because that was a moment of reparations. 1988 American Civil Liberties Act. We as African Americans, the whole civil rights community, NAACP,
That's right.
were urbanly major supporters of the community to support reparations for them having been interned in 1940s. Let me just finish on this note so we can frame this. By the way, her professor, I think you said the $3 trillion war. Yeah. So let me make the statement that I wanted to make, which is America pays for anything she wants. If she wants it, she pays for it. So let me just, all right. Up to over 7 trillion. All right. And I like what you said is that we can construct any structure for preparatory compensation. And one of the things that we've been saying is that reparations can take the form of compensation. Well, first of all, I'm not going to dictate what the commission, that's what the bill is. Right. But it has been modified to say you must develop proposals, you must develop the roadmap, you must develop the solutions. And the idea of reparations in this global sense could be systemic, it could be healthcare, it could be education, it could be saying no HBCU should ever close. It could be business investments, small businesses, all of that can be, why would we run away from that? So let me just give you these numbers, keep going out. We can, all right, and with 7 trillion, the American Rescue Plan was 1.9 trillion. You're still getting that money. The CHIPS plan that we passed just now, 280 billion. That's the little chips and research. Affordable Care Act was 930 billion over 10 years. CBO says that it's 1.8 trillion. The Inflation Reduction Act, we're spending about 433 billion. We're saying that we're getting in revenue. So that's just an example of how we spend money. And that we spend money when we spend money. And then the last point is this little book. I know we'll have a moment to speak, but this little book. And I think I'll do that in closing. If we're going around another round, I won't do that right now.
Oh no, we're coming back around.
Yeah, so I'll do that in closing. But the idea is definable harm, there's no problem with proving it. And so in gathering these co-sponsors, I went one by one. Some came on en masse, obviously. But then I went one by one and I would sit on the floor and I would bring up these statistics. When you see us buzzing around voting, there's a long period of time getting them one by one, one by one. But the obstacle in the road is the apprehension unnecessarily of those who could move for the executive order, which I am determined not to let them excuse themselves from that ultimate decision. Because when it comes to African Americans, there's always the question, wait. And so I go everywhere to encourage you to not wait and tell them that we have to pass HR 40.
Thank you. go down even further in terms of the how, right? So when we think about Professor Billness, you laid out well and persuasively that there's a precedent. So in the paper that we've written, we laid out that there's a precedent. There are models, programs that we can point to. But there are those in Congress and on the street who say, well, how would you do this? The issue is not merely how much, but literally how. And so given all the programs that we examined, that you've examined as my co-author, can you point to some models, not just precedent, models for who gets paid and how, right? So in other words, there are children who have been segregated, placed who live in food deserts, who live with respiratory illnesses, who are victims of an unjust healthcare system. There are veterans who were not served or well served during World War II in terms of being denied housing benefits and educational benefits. We've got a variety of people who have been harmed. How do we deliver reparatory compensation for them? Now, let me just say this parenthetically. The phrase, the term reparatory compensation is a term that we use in our paper. It came into being as a consequence of my colleague who helped us think through, right? What do we say about the ways in which white people, non-Black people get reparations? We call it reparatory compensation, right? So with that said, Professor Billness, how? And I'm gonna unfairly ask everyone to just trim their responses just a tad bit so we can get to the questions in the audience.
Right. Well, let me just say that the government has a huge amount of experience in determining eligibility, in administering programs. I mean, we have programs for so many different kinds of people. I mean, we have programs for coal miners, for hemophiliacs, for people who live in places where the military has closed bases, for people impacted by trade agreements, for fishermen, for farmers farming 500 different kinds of crops. We have 200 programs for fishing. We have programs for people wrongly convicted of crimes, for property owners whose buildings are damaged, for harbor workers, rail workers, victims of human trafficking, and dozens of other programs. And in each of these programs, the Department of Labor is basically a giant administrator of many, many, many programs, but there are dozens of agencies in government that administer these programs. And when I was at the Commerce Department, that's one of the things we did. So I think that typically there is a process for claiming a certain amount. Typically, programs, once Congress has deemed that there is a harm, the concept is a no-fault concept, which is that it doesn't matter where the harm came from. It doesn't matter if you planted your crop wrong, or if it was a pest, a predator, a storm, whatever it is, you get the compensation if the crop fails. The no-fault concept is very important here. Let me just make one point about how these programs are paid for. These programs are paid for through a variety of techniques. They are funded through excise taxes, through trust funds, through special assessments, and through subsidized insurance, as well as through tax dollars. So, for example, the National Vaccine Injury Fund is paid for by a 75-cent excise tax on pharmaceutical companies for every vaccine that is injected in anyone's arm per disease. So, for example, the MMR vaccine is $2.25 per vaccine. This goes into a trust fund, which has paid out about $5 billion to those injured through vaccines. There's another new program specifically for COVID vaccine injuries. The deal is that the manufacturers pay this excise tax in return for being indemnified against lawsuits for drugs that are approved by the FDA. And there are dozens of programs that are funded with that kind of mechanism. There are, of course, huge programs, including insurance for the FDIC and pension guarantee, corporation insurance, crop insurance, flood insurance, where we give extremely government subsidized insurance as a sort of preventative compensatory reparation and so forth. So the bottom line here is that, exactly as the Congresswoman said, and if the government wants to do it, the government can come up with a way to do it, to determine the eligibility, to find a way to pay for it. I never imagined 2 years ago that 2 years later we would still be, in a way, just a little bit of the way through getting to the bottom of how many different programs of what I call reparatory compensation we have. Finally, just one more point on the wording of reparatory compensation. I serve as the U.S. member of the United Nations Committee of Experts, as it's called. The subject of reparations, which the UN has taken up, reparations is like a 5-pronged thing. What the U.S. is not very good at doing is actually apologizing and taking responsibility. What it does typically and repeatedly is it pays financial restitution for anything that impairs people's economic livelihood. And that's what we see again and again and again. So we have sort of called this reparatory compensation, which describes very accurately, we feel, what the government does.
Not to overstate the point, but if we were to summarize our paper with respect to the different ways in which you can engage in reparatory compensation, if you can imagine the federal government recognizing a harm and reaching into its wallet and pulling out the debit card, pulling out a credit card, right, pulling out cash. There are different ways of paying, right? Different sources of funding, as well as my colleague has pointed out, recognizing different victims of discrimination, of a harm with different programs, right? So, Professor Sullivan, one of the things that I think a great many of us are curious about is if you're seeking to essentially exonerate a history. Callie House was a person, right? She had children. She lost a year of her life. She was a widow. And you're trying to essentially exonerate her personal story, her history. But I think for many of us, when we think about pardons, that seems complicated. We know a little bit about, Kim Kardashian and President Trump, but there's a whole department in the Department of Justice, the White House, counsel's office. Can you explain about the mechanics of how do we go about getting a pardon?
Okay, so it's both simple and complicated at once, and I'll be very brief. Congresswoman Lee talked about that book that she has in her lap. So Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution says that the president has the power to grant pardons. So presidential power, virtually unrestrained. Our past president pushed that almost past the limits or threatened to, but virtually unrestrained. You can't do it for impeachment. You can't do it to commit crime. But so President Biden tomorrow could say, I pardon Callie House posthumously. It's done. Most presidents, with the exception of President Trump, most presidents in modern history have given to the Justice Department the authority to vet these claims of pardons. And the reason is that most presidents believe that the presidency is bigger than the individual. And they, even though they have the power to do something, they don't exercise that power. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. That doesn't mean you should do it, right? That's Frankenstein story. That's this you can build it. You see what can happen, right? Or Jurassic Park. That's that story, right? So most presidents say, Justice Department, look at this. There's a pardon attorney in the Justice Department. You file a petition. It goes to the Justice Department. The Justice Department vets it, and the Justice Department makes a recommendation to the president. They have pre-established criteria as to when pardon should be granted. And if they meet those criteria, then the Justice Department will make a recommendation, a positive recommendation to the president, and then the president decides whether to do it or not. That's generally how the process works. On the ground, most people send it to justice and try to get it in directly to the president as well, and will accept the pardon on either of the two mechanisms.
Last question here, before we go to the audience, at least for question two. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, if you could just say a little bit about the provisions of HR 40. I mean, we hear people talking about it, but what is the vehicle by which we're going to secure reparations?
So HR 40 is the, HR 40
is the establishment of a commission. So its full title is a commission to study slavery, now modified, and develop reparation proposals. So it is particularly focused on giving the roadmap. I don't know if we took note of the fact when George Floyd, my constituent, grew up in Houston in my district, his whole family, and proudly CUNY homes, public housing. Just a heinous and unspeakable death. And at that time, as you can see, sort of seismic change started to come. Corporations randomly were setting up billions of dollars, and that's the private sector. No roadmap, just scratching their head. Who can they find? What local community group? No consistent structure. So we want HR 40 to be the roadmap for the solutions, building on the work you're doing here, building on two professors' work and what you're doing here, the harm and then the solution. So the commission will be a 13-person commission. It will have funding. The appointees will be academicians, criminologists, sociologists, economists, business persons. They will hold hearings across the nation. We added that. We will not sit in Washington. We will hold hearings to get a selective sense of the harm across the nation. And I'll just give you one of its tasks. Identify, compile, and synthesize the relevant corpus of evidentiary documentation of the institution of slavery, which existed within the United States and the colonies that became the United States from 1619 through 1865. And then it goes on to say what it would do. I'm not going to read that, but I am going to say, and focus on the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the matters described, and it goes on. So it is both historical, but then it jumps up to say, and what's happening to African Americans now? What is the lingering continued impact? Out of that will come a roadmap. Now this is government. And one of the things that I use when I'm speaking colloquially to individuals or a speech, I'm not coming to Mrs. Jones' door and knock on her door and say, give me your money. I'm not going to private citizens' homes. I'm not coming into your neighborhood. I'm not asking for your house. I'm not taking your land. But what I am doing, as has been said, the government knows how to do compensation. The government knows how to fix the Marshall Plan in the 1940s. They knew how to do that very well. The dollars, and by the way, I'm wearing a Ukraine pin. I've been to Ukraine. I'm committed to this democratic effort, but of course, you know, I run into my community, my people, and I have to explain the circumstances because they will account for all those dollars that we're paying out to Ukraine. We know how to do that. That is to do that very large defense budget. I think it is legitimate. That's a personal acknowledgement, but that is expending dollars, a lot of dollars. So I'm not going to let reparations take a back seat when I agree with the gist of all of us here, that we know how to do it and do it well. And we also know how to do, I like to use the terminology, in kind. And I mentioned the long litany of in kind, changing the educational system for America as relates to the Black community, urban centers, rural centers, changing how we do education as relates to historically Black colleges, which have come into their own now in the 21st century. So what my argument or my point to you is that this is going to be the mechanical, block by block building of the roadmap to then be used by the federal government to repair the damage.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I'd like to do is a kind of benedictory note for the evening is to hear from two organizations who partnered with the William Monroe Charter Collaborative for Social Justice. We endeavored to partner with two leading women's organizations to lend support for the petition for presidential posthumous pardon for Callie House. And so I'm going to call on Erica Swearington Cumsey, who leads the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which, as you recall, has a history which goes back to Ida B. Wells. And I want to call on Lynn Dimely, who is the co-president of, or I should say the president of the National Congress of Black Women, whose history and legacy goes back to Coretta Scott King and Shirley Chisholm and our good friend, I'm looking at my wife, you're gonna kill me. I can't, I don't know why, but I'm blanking on the C. Dolores Tucker, of course, in Philadelphia. Thank you, thank you. If you all could just give us your thoughts in a few minutes about your work with the clinic, work with Reparations and Callie House.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Erica Swearingen Blankency. I am a member of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, and I serve as the senior advisor to our national 30th president, Dr. Andrea Brooks Smith. We have been thrilled and excited to be a participant in this conversation that has been long overdue regarding compensation for the various hurts and pains of our people. It's been truly an honor to work with the students at Harvard and you all, but I just want to mention something. When Callie House was starting the National Mutual Benefit Fund, we were starting NACWC. This was starting at the same time in 1896. So we're talking about 126 years ago. For some people, that time frame, appears to be so long. But for those of us that look like us, that time frame was not that long ago. We are still feeling those effects. I recently went into a craft store with my husband, and on display, they had cotton. Now, to some people, this would mean nothing, but to have an ancestor that you know or a parent who either sharecropped and picked cotton, it means something completely different. It's not a decorative piece. It is a piece that brings pain. So in saying this, Mary Church Terrell, our first national president, led us in the suffrage movement. Ida B. Wells, one of our founding members, led us in the anti-lynching movement. We, the women of NACWC, firmly believe that we will also lead in this movement to exonerate Callie House. Not only that, to get compensation for the various hurts of our people throughout the time. Mary Church Terrell once said, and so lifting as we climb, onward and upward we go, struggling and striving, seeking no favors. We are not asking for a favor. We are asking for just due compensation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor Scruggs,
Brooks Sullivan, Vilmas, and to one of our favorite members of Congress, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee. I'm honored to be here this evening representing the National Congress of Black Women. And we are so very grateful to all of you for this panel discussion. Very enlightening, eye-opening, and inspirational. And the reparations movement and the great work of our unsung hero, Mrs. Callie House. So the NCBW was founded in 1984, and two of our many legendary founding members are the Honorable Shirley Chisholm and C. Dolores Tucker. NCBW serves as a nonpartisan voice of advocacy for issues affecting the appointment of women at all levels of private and public industry, with the goal to increase the representation of Black women in all areas, including education, public, economic, and social arenas. The National Congress of Black Women is driven by our vision of a world where Black women experience equal rights in every aspect of life. And our mission is to vigorously advocate for equality and empowerment of Black women, their families, their communities, and throughout the nation and all around the world. So the chapters of NCBW across this nation are pleased and excited to collaborate with the William and Rowe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice and with the Criminal Justice Institute of the Harvard Law School in expanding the education and awareness of our members, other women, our brothers, our youth, as well as the general public about the reparations movement and the heroic work of Ms. Callie House. Our strategic engagement includes hosting webinars, community events, video productions, extensive social media campaigns leveraged by us and other organizations. The National Congress of Black Women was instrumental in the work of bringing truth to the Capitol through the presentation of the bust of Sojourner Truth in Washington, D.C., as well as a bust in the California State Capitol of the trailblazer and Dean of African American Politics in California, the Honorable Mervyn M. Dimely, who happens to be my father. We know at NCBW how to get things done to bring honor and recognition to our shero and heroes. We've rolled up our sleeves and we've begun to work with you already. As a retired professor of legal studies and business, I had the privilege and the joy of working with Professors Brooks, students from the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice earlier this year on the development of a program designed to bring awareness to the public about Mrs. Callie House. The students and I traveled to Nashville, Tennessee, the home of Mrs. Callie House, to engage in research on the history of Mrs. Callie House, as well as to engage with key public and private individuals and groups on the legacy of Callie House. So in closing, as one of our founders, the great Shirley Chisholm said, we must reject not only the stereotypes that others hold of us, but also the stereotypes that we hold of ourselves. In keeping with the truth, the National Congress of Black Women stands strong in the rejection of the untruths spoken by others, as well as the belief that reparations is too hard, too long, too late, and too much. But in the words of my father, Mervyn Dimely, we urge the White House to seek not to do what is popular, rather seek to do what is right. So thank you for your leadership and dedication to the reparations movement. And we look forward to the day when we will all gather at the White House that was built by our people for the posthumous pardon of the mother of reparations, Mrs. Callie House. Thank you very much.
First of all, let me just extend a word of appreciation to the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs for your support of this work, and certainly to the National Congress of Black Women. These two organizations have worked with our students over the course of a semester, making weekly meetings, studying the history of Callie House, learning a bit, Professor Sullivan, about the pardon process. Our students have laid out a plan with them around how to build support. And one of the things that's encouraging to me, and I hope you gathered from the beginning of this program, is there is a great deal of underappreciated, unrecognized power of women. If a laundress, as they were called back then, could create a movement of 300,000 people with chapters all across the South, an organization that literally collected well over 100,000 signatures, well before the age of Twitter, well before Facebook, well before Instagram. If those women could do that then, what more can we expect of these women today? So if I could just ask you to put your hands together for our client organizations. And because I was always taught that every meeting should end on the day, at least end on the day it began, that we have to draw this wonderful occasion to a close, but not before I extend a word of appreciation to my representative, Sheila Jackson Lee. Though I was raised in South Carolina, I was born in El Paso, Texas, and like the Bushes, I can at least claim to be a Texan. Sure stay in Texas. I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to thank you for your in-depth, substantive grasp of this issue, and the fact that we owe so much to you for literally creating legislative momentum where for years our people were frustrated. So just thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you to Professor Sullivan, who, when my name popped up on his cell phone, he did not decline to take the call. And when I asked him to take up the case of seeking to exonerate history in the form of, in terms of rescuing the reputation, the character, if you will, of Callie House, he put his students to work. He lent his expertise, his experience, his national presence, right, in prominence to this cause. So we look forward to these women's organizations supporting this cause, bringing about the exoneration of a history. Lastly, I want to thank my colleague, Professor Linda Vilmas. So if Callie House is a face of reparations, as a godmother, a mother of a movement, we need the figures, we need the statistics, we need the empirical basis for reparations. When I had the good fortune of having one of the world's leading experts on budgets, on finance, come to me with a program about reparations. Now, she's a Quaker, I'm just a Methodist, right? So, Quakers may have an answer for this, but we call it a blessing, right? And it was a blessing for her to come and to say, can we write a paper together to build the empirical case for reparations? Now, if I weren't grateful enough for Professor Vilmas, Professor Sullivan, I'm Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, I'm even more grateful for all of you. Why? Because when we think about the history of movements, which I teach at the Kennedy School, movements are built of people. It does not mean you have a cast of thousands, right? You recall the Montgomery boycott did not begin with 10,000, did not begin with 1,000, began with a few people. Here we are on the Vineyard in Massachusetts, where Belinda Sutton years ago petitioned the Massachusetts state legislature for reparatory compensation, Professor Vilmas, in the form of a pension. So we've gathered here to lend support for HR 40, to lend support for the exoneration of the history in terms of Callie House and the Little League Builder movement. So we simply want to say thank you for everyone in this audience, certainly those who are on Facebook, those who are on Instagram, those who are viewing this online. And we ask that you look, is there something I forgot?
I want you to have the final closing, and I just want to say a word.
Well, you go ahead and say a word now, so I don't leave you out.
Yeah, so you won't, I need to express my appreciation first for having the opportunity. For having the opportunity to be here. And to join with my appreciation for the audience, to acknowledge my hope in President Biden for both the pardon for Callie House, and to thank the dynamic women, the Colored Women's Club, and of course, the Congress. I knew both C. Dolores Tucker and Shirley Chisholm, and Sojourner Truth is in the United States Congress as the first Black woman to ever come in my legislation and Hillary Clinton. And I'm not sure, Mr. Emily, whether you all were there. 2,000 people were there the first year of President Obama, who presided over the bringing of her statue to the United States House of Representatives. So I need to add my thank yous. I need to thank Dr. Ron Daniels, who you know, over the National Commission on Reparations and the 350 organizations, which included Urban League, NAACP, National Network, and Human Rights, and Color Change. I just want to put them on the record. But what I wanted to close with is this book that I held up before. And to be able to say that this is part of the repertory compensation. Because if you read the elements of the Bill of Rights, they have not been totally, I'm going to use the word betrothed, wedded to us. We have had challenges with the First Amendment. We have not been able to move or have free speech as evidenced by the Civil Rights Movement. We've had our challenges and not had the fullness of the Fifth Amendment, due process and the right to property. If you go throughout the South in the 20th century, our property was taken. This is all in the calculation of repertory compensation. We lost a magnitude of property in the 20th century. Taxation, foreclosure, heirship, confusion, but really taking advantage of the local governmental entities, which we've received no compensation. And go quickly to the trial by your peers and the right to trial by jury of your peers. We've suffered in that circumstance. Skip over to the 13th Amendment, the ending of slavery, but allowing convict leasing, which took us all through the 20th century, never compensated. It was an issue that we had in Houston or in Texas. So I'll finish on the 13th Amendment. We didn't get the fullness of that. The 14th Amendment, we were still suffering under the equal protection of the law. And now we come to the 15th Amendment in 2020, 21, 22. Voter suppression is more than we've ever seen beyond the time when we couldn't vote. And so I wanted to end on the note of the book that says that we have organized to create a more perfect union. Our history of the apology and reparations did not equal to the rights that we should have gotten out of this book. And so I will quote Shirley Chisholm, and you know what I'm going to say. If you don't have a seat at the table, then get your chair. I want to make sure that HR 40 has us getting a chair. And then secondarily, my mentor, the Honorable Barbara Jordan. She was a tall, regal woman like Sojourner Truth, who I have to skip in and say, told someone when they said, yes, sir, in the back of the room, an abolitionist and a suffragette, ain't I a woman? and I'm born 13 children and seen most all sold into slavery. Barbara was tall and regal too, and somebody looked at her and said, well, what do you people want? What do you people want? You've heard, has anyone heard that before? What do you people want? And she answered, the same thing you want, the promise of America. I yield back.
Could not leave this occasion without extending a word of appreciation to my staff director, Devin Jerome Crawford, to our property assistant, Boy Lamel Hay, and to my wife, who serves as the president of the board of the National Congress of Black Women. And I note in the audience the presence of Reverend Stephen Green, who leads Faithful Black Lives, the pastor of St. Luke AME Church in New York City. And my colleague, Professor Bilmes, has made me aware that there's a notable eminent scientist who is the Dean of Natural Sciences at the UMass Amherst. I've totally mangled your title. Dean, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. We are just so delighted to have all of you here. And I hope you can tell from the rigor of the discussion, right? The passion for reparations and the concern for women lost to history that we have in this room, the talent, the ability, the brilliance, the unapologetic Blackness to bring about real change in our time. So with that said, thank you and good night.